Say the word Paladin to most D&D players, and they picture a shining knight with a warhorse and a code of honor. Almost nobody pictures the actual guy the word came from. A real historical office in the court of a real king. One that had nothing to do with religion at first, and everything to do with literally living inside the palace. This is the longest one yet, because the Paladin has more layered real-world history than almost any other class in the game. A name borrowed from Imperial Rome, a legend built around a doomed rearguard battle, and a design history where the strict lawful good code that defined the class for decades didn't even survive into the current edition in its original form. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly how an 8th century emperor's inner circle turned into a fantasy character class, why the word paladin almost meant something closer to bureaucrat than hero, and why one particular betrayal in medieval literature is still baked into how modern paladins can lose their powers. Let's get into it. To understand where paladin comes from, you actually have to go back further than knights entirely, to a single word buried in the administration of the Roman Empire. The word traces back to the Latin palatinus, pronounced palatinus, meaning of the palace, specifically referring to the Palatine Hill in Rome, where the emperor's residence sat. A palatinus was a high-ranking official who lived and worked inside the imperial household itself. Not a warrior, not a hero, just someone with a job title tied to physical proximity to the emperor. That root word survived the fall of Rome and got picked up by Frankish kings, who used a similar title, comes palatinus, or count of the palace, for their own top administrators and judges. So for a few centuries, paladin was essentially a bureaucratic title. That completely changes once we get to the 8th century, and one specific historical figure, Charlemagne, king of the Franks, starting in 768, king of the Lombards from 774, and eventually crowned emperor of what became the Carolingian Empire in the year 800. Charlemagne was real, his empire was real, and he really did have trusted nobles and elite companions serving in his court. The famous 12 peers, though, belong to legend rather than documented history. Here's where history and legend start to blur. Roughly 3 centuries after Charlemagne's actual reign, French poets writing in a tradition called the chanson de geste, literally song of heroic deeds, began telling stories about Charlemagne's inner circle, and they gave that inner circle a name, the 12 peers, or the paladins. The number 12 wasn't historical accuracy, it was a deliberate echo of the 12 apostles, meant to position Charlemagne almost as a Christ-like ruler, surrounded by his own sworn devotees. This is a genuinely important detail because it tells you the paladins were never really presented as ordinary historical soldiers. From their very first appearance in literature, they were built to be legendary, half history, half religious allegory. The most famous work in this tradition by far is The Song of Roland, written somewhere between 1050 and 1115, again centuries after Charlemagne actually lived. It tells the story of Roland, described as Charlemagne's nephew and the greatest of the 12 peers, wielding a magic sword called Durandal and a war horn called Oliphant. The poem centers on the Battle of Roncevaux Pass, where Roland commands the rear guard of Charlemagne's army as it withdraws from a campaign in Spain. Roland is betrayed. His own stepfather, a Frankish nobleman named Ganelon, secretly tips off the opposing Saracen forces about the rearguard's position out of personal resentment. Roland's forces are ambushed by an overwhelming army. True to the poem's whole ethos of glory over caution, Roland refuses to sound his horn and call for reinforcements until it's far too late. He fights nearly to the last man and only blows Oliphant once the battle is essentially already lost, so that Charlemagne's forces can at least recover the bodies and avenge the dead. What's genuinely wild is that there's a kernel of real history buried in all of this. Charlemagne's own biographer, a scholar named Einhard, wrote an account of Charlemagne's life, and briefly mentions a real nobleman named Roland, described only as a lord of the Breton March, who died in a battle at Roncevaux Pass. That's it. One sentence, no detail, no legendary sword, no dramatic betrayal. Historians widely believe this single obscure mention is the entire historical seed that the legendary Roland grew out of. 3 centuries of storytelling turned one forgotten casualty into the greatest knight in medieval literature. This is where many of the themes we associate with the D&D Paladin begin to take shape, not from sparse historical records, but from medieval legend. Roland's unwavering devotion to honor, Ganelon's betrayal from within the ranks, and the consequences of abandoning one's ideals all echo through later depictions of paladins. While D&D didn't literally copy these stories into its rules, those same ideas of loyalty, sacrifice, and the danger of moral failure became central to the class's identity. And this legend didn't stay static. Italian Renaissance poets Matteo Maria Boiardo and Ludovico Ariosto later expanded the Paladin mythology even further in epic poems called Orlando Innamorato and Orlando Furioso, works that were once read as widely and respected as highly as Shakespeare, sending the Paladins on increasingly fantastical adventures involving sorcery, magical creatures, and journeys far beyond anything in the original Song of Roland. If you want to know where D&D's later willingness to give paladins genuinely fantastical, magical power comes from, rather than just very good knight, you can trace a real literary line all the way from those Renaissance epics. By the Renaissance, the word paladin no longer meant a palace official at all. Across Europe, it had become shorthand for the ideal knight, loyal, courageous, and unwavering in service to a higher cause. That literary image is the one fantasy writers, and eventually Dungeons & Dragons, would inherit. So how does a centuries-old French literary tradition become a D&D character class? The direct line runs through one specific piece of 20th century fiction. Dungeons & Dragons co-creator Gary Gygax stated plainly that the Paladin class was drawn from three sources: the Paladins of Charlemagne, Arthurian legend, and the historical code of chivalry broadly. But the single most direct inspiration, the spark that actually made Gygax want to build the class, was a 1961 fantasy novel called 3 Hearts and 3 Lions by author Paul Anderson. The novel's protagonist is explicitly modeled on the Charlemagne Paladin tradition, and Anderson's book had an outsized influence on early D&D generally. This is the same novel that helped establish tropes like troll regeneration and the alignment concept of law versus chaos that D&D later built its entire cosmology around. The Paladin class itself first appeared in 1975 in Supplement 1, Greyhawk, co-written by Gary Gygax and Robert J. Kuntz. The same supplement, notably, that gave the game some of its earliest additional character options beyond the original 4 classes. At this stage, the Paladin wasn't even a standalone class. It was introduced as a specialized subclass of the fighting man. By the time the original Player's Handbook was published in 1978, the Paladin had been promoted to one of 5 available subclasses, sitting alongside the earliest version of the Druid we covered in a previous episode. From the very beginning, the class came loaded with restrictions that don't exist for any other class in the game. Original Paladins needed exceptionally high ability scores across the board just to qualify, a bar so steep that in practice, very few characters could actually become one without generous dice rolls or deliberate stat generation. And in first edition, Paladins were restricted to human characters only, full stop. No other race in the game was permitted to take the class, a restriction that took years of Dragon magazine articles proposing homebrew exceptions before official material caught up. The alignment restriction is where things get really rigid and really interesting. From first edition all the way through third edition, spanning roughly a quarter century of the game's history, Paladins were mechanically required to maintain lawful good alignment, full stop, no exceptions. And this wasn't a soft suggestion. The rules stated explicitly that if a Paladin ever knowingly and willingly committed an evil act, they lost Paladinhood immediately and irrevocably, not just their alignment label, but literally all their special class features, reducing them to a plain fighter of the same level. If a Paladin committed an evil act while magically controlled or otherwise not fully in command of their actions, they'd still lose their status, though in that case, they could eventually atone and earn their abilities back. This is the Paladins can fall concept that's become such a well-known piece of D&D culture, and it's a direct mechanical descendant of the Roland and Ganelon betrayal narrative baked into the class from its literary origin. The second edition Player's Handbook, published in 1989, is actually explicit about the class's inspirations in its own text. It lists Roland and the 12 peers of Charlemagne alongside Sir Lancelot, Sir Gawain, and Sir Galahad as historical and literary examples of what a paladin represents. That's a direct textual acknowledgement, printed in an official rulebook, of exactly the lineage we just walked through. Everything changed with 4th edition. Starting there, paladins could be of any alignment at all, and the entire falling from grace mechanic was removed. A paladin became defined by their devotion to a specific deity rather than by rigid universal moral alignment. This was a genuinely controversial shift in the community at the time. and it set up the framework that 5th edition still uses today. Paladins built around personal oaths rather than alignment restrictions, which we'll get into in detail later in this video. A few mechanical details that even longtime players tend to miss. 1. The Paladin's signature magic item throughout D&D's history is the Holy Avenger, a specific type of enchanted sword that deals extra damage against evil creatures and grants additional magical protection. It's one of the very few magic items in the game's history designed around a single class. Other characters can wield a Holy Avenger, but throughout most editions, only a Paladin can unlock its full magical potential, reinforcing the class's identity as uniquely blessed rather than just a fighter who prays sometimes. 2. Paladins have had access to a special mount as a core class feature since very early editions, typically described as an unusually intelligent, magically resilient warhorse. This wasn't just flavor text. Mechanically, the mount was often treated as a semi-permanent magical companion rather than a purchasable animal, reinforcing the idea that a paladin's bond, whether to their god, their oath, or their steed, is fundamentally different from an ordinary knight's relationship with their horse. 3. The Paladin's healing ability, Lay on Hands, has one of the more mechanically unusual designs in the game's spellcasting adjacent features. In most editions, rather than working like a spell with a set number of uses per day, it functions as a pool of total healing points a Paladin can draw from and distribute across a day however they choose. Heal one person for a lot, or spread small amounts across several allies. That flexible pool design is genuinely uncommon compared to how nearly every other class's abilities are structured around discrete, individually cast uses. 4. The Detect Evil ability, present in some form in nearly every edition, made Paladins one of the only classes in the game with a signature ability that could repeatedly sense the moral alignment of creatures around them without relying on spell slots. This single ability generated more real-world tabletop arguments about metagaming and player versus character knowledge than almost any other rule in D&D's history, since it puts genuinely difficult questions in front of the table. Does a Paladin's player act on information their character has, even if it creates an uncomfortable shoot-first dynamic at the table? 5th edition's biggest structural change to the class was replacing the old alignment requirement entirely with a system of sworn oaths, devotion, ancients, vengeance, and others added later, each granting different powers depending on what the Paladin has actually pledged themselves to. Mechanically, this let designers finally build morally complex Paladins without breaking the class's core identity, since your oath, not the alignment checkbox, defines what breaking faith even means for your specific character. And here's a detail that ties this whole video back to where we started. One of the later added oaths, the Oath of the Crown, introduced in Sword Coast Adventurer's Guide, is explicitly built around a Paladin devoted to protecting a monarch, a nation, or a legal system rather than a religious cause. That's not a coincidence. It's the class circling directly back to the original historical meaning of the word Paladin, before Charlemagne, before Roland, before any of the religious knight imagery, back to the Roman-derived idea of an elite figure whose entire purpose is loyalty to a royal court. 14 centuries after the word first meant an official who lives in the palace, 5th edition D&D quietly gave players a way to play exactly that. There's also a dark mirror to this, the Oathbreaker, a Paladin who has broken their sworn oath and continues to draw power from it anyway, corrupted rather than lost. This is the modern mechanical echo of the old 1st edition Fallen Paladin concept. Except now, instead of simply becoming a fighter, a Fallen Paladin can become something actively worse, drawing on twisted, necrotic versions of their original abilities. It's the Ganelon betrayal DNA of the class, still present, just redesigned for a system built around player agency instead of a strict universal alignment grid. Worth mentioning too, the modern Paladin's holy warrior aesthetic, plate armor, sworn brotherhoods, defense of the faithful, draws almost as much from real medieval history as it does from Charlemagne's legend. Historical Christian military orders like the Knights Templar and Knights Hospitaller, founded during the Crusades to protect pilgrims and defend religious territory, heavily shaped the visual and thematic identity most players associate with the class today: the sworn brotherhood, the religious backing, the martial discipline. So the modern Paladin is really a blend of two separate historical threads: Charlemagne's legendary court for the name and the code of honor, and real Crusade-era knightly orders for the aesthetic and religious structure players actually picture at the table. So the next time someone at your table plays a Paladin, remember, They're playing a class built from a word that originally just meant someone of the palace, attached centuries later to a legendary betrayal at a mountain pass and rebuilt in modern editions to circle all the way back to protecting a crown rather than a church. Which class do you want me to dig into next? Drop it in the comments. I'm ranking them by request.